Everybody, just before we get started with the show here, I want to make a quick shout out to the good folks at Springs Homes for supporting Studio 809 and this podcast. They're in the business of real estate because they love helping clients achieve their goals. Competitive, collaborative, and trustworthy. Meet the real estate pros at springshomes.com.
This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I am your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can find me on my website, hikingbob.com, for links to my social media accounts, my column at the Colorado Springs Independent, my previous podcast that we've done. This is going to be number 293, I think. And also my photography website and all that other kind of good stuff you can find at hikingbob.com, or you can also sign up for my newsletter and get a weekly email with the summary of the latest podcast column and any other exciting news that may come on. So all that at hikingbob.com. Today you're doing something a little different, and we've kind of done something like this before. We've had book authors and either reviewed their books or had them on the podcast. But today we're doing something a little different. We're talking about how to make new parks. And my guest is Victoria Newhouse, who wrote a book called Parks of the 21st Century, Reinvented Landscapes and Reclaimed Territories. Victoria, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about your background where it comes to parks and open spaces and stuff like that.
Well, I am not a landscape architect. I'm an architectural historian, and I've published 5 books, each one on a cultural institution. Like one was on museums, another one was on concert halls and opera houses, and so on. And I came to this project completely by chance. I was asked to write about a new cultural center in Athens, Greece, that was designed by the Italian architect Renzo Piano. And it's an enormous complex with an opera house and a concert hall and performance spaces and so forth, and a park. And so since I devoted a chapter to each one of these different elements of the cultural center, I had to have a chapter on the park, of course. And I had never written about landscape, and I had really very little background knowledge about landscape. So I got a hold of a landscape architect, a man who was teaching at the time in one of the universities in the Middle West. And he helped me write this chapter, in the course of which I became completely fascinated by the whole discipline of landscape architecture. And that's how the current book came into being.
Great. And it's a really interesting book on, how, I guess the idea is how it's using spaces that exist for something else. So what kind of research did you do? How did you pick the locations that you have in here? And there are a lot of locations all around the world in this book. How did you come to finding these particular places to highlight the different types of reclaimed areas?
Well, first of all, we had to set out some parameters. And one was that it had to be a park, it had to be public, it had to be new, it had to have been opened within the last 20 years. And it had to be on some sort of reclaimed land. You had written to me in one of your emails that that land is being bought in your part of the country. Well, none of this land was bought. This was all land that had been previously occupied by something industrial that had become obsolete, like a factory or a storage house, or by some other, for example, a railroad. I mean, our best example here in New York of an obsolete railroad is the Highline, which gets 8 million visitors a year now. So there was never a case that we never looked at a park for which land had to be acquired. So that was the first rule. And then the second rule, it had to be beautiful. It had to be something attractive. And it had to have some sort of environmental role, some sort of water control or water unpolluting waterways that had been polluted, those were the rules we went by. We started off by looking online at parks, and I worked again with a professional landscape architect who was quite knowledgeable about what was being done around the world. And we started off looking online, and then if something looked likely, we would visit.
We'll talk about this. We do have a piece of land that we are working on in Colorado Springs that we did purchase, but it also is a reclamation of an industrial site. So we'll talk about that in a second. Did you find that planners were skipping over land to reclaim to use as parks, or is that a more common thing than I may think it is? Out here in the West, we have a lot of open space, so a lot of times we just buy more land to build a park. Was this more like a urban type of thing where they were trying to find parks and they just went to, let's reclaim this instead of going to find something that hasn't been touched yet? How did these land reclamations, and you talk about quarries and things like that, how did that all come about? I mean, how did planners come to those decisions?
Well, all the parks that we included are urban parks.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very often they're on the fringes of a city, but they are all connected with a city.
Did the planners, was it a kind of a new thing for them to look at reclaiming an old industrial park, for example, or something along those lines, or was this something that they'd been doing anyway? When it came time to build a new park or an open space?
You mean, had they been reclaiming land for other purposes than a park? Is that?
Yeah. Let's go with that.
Yeah. Well, I really don't know, because we zeroed in on the parks. That was our focus, and we came across some very, very interesting examples, like you mentioned, quarries. And we found, parks that had been built in former quarries in very, very unlikely places. Like for example, in Seattle, we found a charming little park that had been, in fact, the site of a quarry, right? And this is not suburban at all. This is in downtown Seattle. And we were amazed to learn that there had been a quarry on that site, but in fact there had been, and that it ran out of the sand or gravel, whatever it was that they were digging up there, and the city decided to make this park. And it's quite small. I think it's just a few acres. I think it's like 3 or 4 acres. And it was really one of the most enjoyable parks that we visited. It was beautifully designed, with paths running through it. It was on a hill. And so, there was a lot of interest to the terrain. It wasn't just a flat piece of land. It was, it was hilly. And then they had done something quite interesting. They had commissioned a local artist to build enormous sculptures on the site, and they were like a very, very large round pillar, rising, I would say, 10 or 15 feet, with a kind of umbrella effect at the top. And it really was, it created an amazing atmosphere. I mean, it was really, it was like being in fairyland.
That sounds gorgeous. And as I've looked through the book, I do have to have as a side note that the photography in here, which demonstrates these sites, is tremendous. And you really get an idea of how well done these parks and open spaces are, how very, you could tell they didn't just pave over, or just, I shouldn't say pave over, wrong word, how they didn't just flatten a piece of land and build some trails on it. There was really some thought into the design to make these very aesthetically pleasing. And every one of the examples that I saw in the book, they're just tremendous ideas in here. Um, what is your target audience for this book? Is it for park planners to give them ideas, or is it for city governments to maybe change how they look at these spaces that they're trying to figure out what to do with, or is it just for the general public? What's your target audience for a book like this, or is it for somebody like me who sits on a board and kind of helps to decide how to spend money? Yeah.
You are a perfect target, of course, for the book. But we were hoping that it would be a general audience, and we were hoping also that it would raise consciousness about the importance of parks, not only for recreation and for relaxation, but also for climate control, because every single one of the parks that we included has some sort of mechanism for to deal with flooding or pollution or whatever other problems there might be in the neighborhood.
Okay. Yeah, even just planting some trees and things like that, obviously, obviously helps the environment, just getting more carbon dioxide transferred out of the air and stuff like that.
Yes.
Is the book designed to maybe give park planners maybe an idea of changing how they do things? You said you're not a park planner. I'm not either. Is it designed for maybe park planners to look at things and maybe get different ideas, or maybe change their perspective on how to build a park? What is that? Was that one of the purposes here?
Yes. I mean, we were very intrigued by several parks that are really self-generating, that were not tremendously designed. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the park. It's next to Frankfurt. It's just on the outskirts of Frankfurt in Germany. And that was really an amazing situation. It had been a small airport built by the American Army in the 1950s. And instead of incurring the expense of demolishing all of the runways, the asphalt and the concrete that had been poured over this land for the airport, the designers decided to break it up, but leave it on the site. So they broke it up sufficiently so that seeds could germinate within the spaces between the different blocks that they had cut up. But they didn't design anything, and there was no design. There was no playground. There are no organized activities there. People just come and find their own means of entertainment. Older people come and they play chess and they play cards, and children. The place was filled with children when we were there, and there were no swings, there was nothing like that, but they were delighted. They were climbing on these pieces of asphalt that had been cut up and running around, and everybody seemed to find something to do there. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that every landscape architect is aware of this kind of a self-generating situation, which we found very interesting.
And I was looking at the pictures of it. What I liked about it too, and this is just a small little thing that just caught my eye, was like, for example, there was what was obviously the runway, and the center line of the runway, the yellow line running down the runway, and how they left that center line there.
Yes.
And then everything around is, like you said, is torn up and things are growing up around it and everything. I thought, what a simple little detail to find. Like, just keep this center line. It draws the eye to it, and this is where people go, and then they have the sides of it to go and recreate. And I love little details like that. I think sometimes they escape our attention unless somebody like you, and in your book, you point things out like that. I really like that. One of the things you have, and I should tell people that when you look at this book, it has a lot of different categories. There's railways, highway caps. We'll talk about that because I really like that idea. Airports, waterside, industry parks, inland industry, quarries, strongholds, and the future. I like how there's so many different categories, and you really were able to break down different types of lands to reclaim. And I find that pretty fascinating because I don't think people think of those as necessarily being a place for a park or outdoor recreation. I think we have to level those things and grade them off and completely scrub them clean to make a new park, but not necessarily the case. That is it.
No, I think that many landscape architects now make a very, very strong effort to retain details like the yellow line on the former runway that you mentioned, to recall the past so as not to completely erase the past. And in China, for example, we found in many of the parks that were built on former factories that the designers had kept enormous pieces of machinery that had served, some tremendous industrial purpose that site had been used for in the past.
Do you think that the way we're approaching things here in the West, and I know this isn't exactly where your book went, where we have funds that we dedicate to purchasing open space. Some of it is urban, some of it is more on the outsides of town, I think. Is that the best way to approach creating new parks for people, or does it depend on the environment? Is your book more geared towards urban as opposed to rural places? The question always is, how much money do we spend to build a park, and should we buy more land or whatever? Is this the better way to do things than just buying more land?
Well, I'm not that familiar with what goes on in the West. I love parks, so all I could say is, whatever has to be done, whether it's buying land or reclaiming land or whatever. I think if you end up with a park, I mean, that's all to the good. And of course, parks, besides everything else that I've mentioned, have a tremendous financial benefit in the sense that land or near a park immediately increases in value.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, and that is something we have found out here too, as we build more parks, people like having their houses near there because they do go up in value. And it seems to help things a lot. The parks in your book strike me as what I have in mind as an urban park. So some paved trails and lots of trees and amenities like that. We're kind of geared towards recreation. Can we build more trails for more backcountry hiking or for cycling and things like that? And we're talking about cycling. We're not talking road bikes, but mountain bikes. Does this concept work well, whether you're creating an urban, nice treed and landscape park, or do these ideas also work well for something more recreationally geared?
I would think that it would work for both. One of the interesting things about new parks that have been built, since the year 2000, is that, formerly, if you think of, again, I'm going to use an example that I know here in the East. When you think of Central Park, which is of course one of the most famous parks in the U.S., it's surrounded by a wall, and that was typical of parks that were designed in the 19th century. Now parks never have a wall around them. And that would be very unusual. And very, very often, on the contrary, the paths in the park kind of line up with paths that in the surroundings, in the environment, whether it's a city or whether it's a suburb or whatever. So I think parks have become really an integral part of a lifestyle.
Talking about out here in the West, where I'm at, we're very much a recreationally oriented society where people tend to spend a lot of times outdoors, hiking, backpacking, camping, which obviously you don't necessarily do camping in a city park, obviously. That's not quite the thing for that.
Well, sometimes you do. There's a wonderful kind of Highline wannabe in Chicago. It's an abandoned railroad that was elevated, and they made an open space and planted grass on it for young kids to come and camp out overnight. So, cool. And that's in the middle of Chicago.
Not the kind of place you that automatically would come to mind for for that type of activity.
That's right. That's
And
right.
the Highline parks I found interesting, and again, because we don't have them out here, but these are elevated highways or elevated railroads
Elevated railroads, yeah.
that, and I remember seeing pictures. I believe you have one here that was in New York City where they, instead of tearing that down, all that superstructure that was around it, cleared it, planted grass and trees, and now you have this beautiful elevated walkway, which I think is, talk about a great use of minimal amount of space where you may not have enough room to clear land for several acres of a park. You just built one on top of this elevated thing. I find that fascinating. Is that something that's been going on for a while, or somebody just all of a sudden think, boy, it's going to cost me a bunch of money to tear this down. Let's just do something else with it?
Well, some people in in the neighborhood of the Highline fought very, very hard. Two men in particular got together and really got the community to back them because the Giuliani administration here at the time they had actually started to tear it down, and it was because of these two men and their ability to inspire people to and have them and make them realize the potential of this thing. It now gets 8 million visitors a year, which is
Wow.
more, which is more than the Metropolitan Museum or MoMA or even the Statue of Liberty.
Holy cow, 8 million people a year. And how long is this park? Is it a mile?
Just under 2 miles.
Wow. So that's plenty of land, but we're talking about a narrow piece of land, but it's just fascinating that somebody thought about doing that. I can't imagine, the cost of tearing something down and hauling all that stuff away and the disruption to the public and the neighborhood and dust and noise and all that other kind of stuff that goes with it. The idea that these guys came up with, no, let's just make a park out and leave it there. I love simple ideas like that just turn things around a little bit. And the benefit is everywhere, financial and aesthetic and all that kind of stuff is really great. We were talking about, quarries, which is one of the things you have in here about reclaiming quarries, and you don't often think of that. We have one in Colorado Springs that the city just purchased from a private owner. It's still in the process of reclaiming the land to make it safe, but it's this huge rock quarry that the company no longer had a desire to keep, and they came to the city and asked the city if they would like to purchase it. And it's on a hillside up against some pretty tall mountains. And the idea that has been put forth is while there'd be hiking trails below it and it connects up back into the national forest and disappears for miles after that, is to make like a mountain biking track on there with different skill levels, and some of it being like double black diamond rated kind of bicycle trails, mountain biking trails, which I think is great. The public is just dying for this to happen. It's going to take a number of years, obviously. Have you seen something in your research for did you see anything geared towards that kind of activities that maybe we need to specialize it?
Yeah, one of the most dramatic former quarries that we visited was just outside of Shanghai. And that's where they built their botanic garden in time for one of their big international expos. And this was a very, very big, a very dramatic quarry with a lake at the bottom of the incision, and a big waterfall flowing into the lake, which was very beautiful and very dramatic. And they built just what you're talking about, a walkway that clings to the face of the rock and spirals down to the water, so that you could touch the water if you like. And you can walk right along there. There actually were two quarries, the very, very large one, which I've just described. And then if you continue on this wooden walkway that they've built, you come to a smaller quarry. So that would be a terrific, area to hike around, a short hike, or even to bicycle.
Excellent. I think there's even talk about the one we have about doing a rock climbing training course on one part of this thing.
That's
So
a great idea. That's a very good idea.
yeah, it sounds like I can't wait till it gets done. But it's like I said, it's going to be many years down the road because of environmental concerns with this old rock quarry. Not that there was anything. It wasn't like we were mining plutonium out of there or anything dangerous like that. But obviously there are hazards involved and stuff. Do you know, in the course of your research, when you talk to landscape architects or park planners or people involved in this thing, did they find that this was pretty cost effective to reclaim these lands and to
Very
build a
expensive.
park?
Yeah, incredibly expensive.
Uh,
I mean, the one of the biggest projects for reclaiming land is the former garbage dump in Staten Island, which was the biggest garbage dump in the world when it was operative. Thank goodness, they closed it down. It was an eyesore. But it cost hundreds of millions of dollars to reclaim that land because it was so polluted. And that's the problem with these sites that have been used as a dump or as a place for industry. They are tremendously polluted, and it's extremely expensive to clean them up.
Did you find that within these communities was there resistance to reclaiming these because of cost? Was there any resistance to it? Or were people willing to say, it's better that we just get this land back and spend whatever we need to spend to reclaim it?
Yeah, we found no resistance. I mean, people really love the idea of a park, and it's approached differently in different countries. Of course, I mean, in the United States, certainly in the parks that we came across, each one was subject to dozens and sometimes even hundreds of community meetings so that people could express their ideas about what they wanted, how they saw the project. A little bit of that takes place in Europe, but not on the same scale as the US. And of course, in China, there's absolutely no communication with the population. They're just given what the government decides they want to give them.
Right. Yeah, we do do in a master planning process out here. We definitely do a lot of community engagement and explain to people what's going on and what do you want? What can we put in here that you would like and try to make all the pieces of the puzzle that everybody wants fit. It's interesting to see that knowing these things cost so much money to do that people are still like, yeah, let's just go ahead and do it anyway, regardless of, I shouldn't say regardless of what it costs. I'm sure there's a limit, but people were willing to invest the millions of dollars to reclaim these lands to build them.
Yes, it's very heartening.
So tell us about some of the research you did. You kind of talked a little bit about you went all over the place, but how many countries did you visit and how long did it take you to gather all this information? This is a pretty hefty book with a lot of stuff in it.
Well, the research and the writing together took 5 years, and we traveled to many countries. We traveled across the United States, and we went to many European countries, Switzerland and Holland, France, and then we went as far as China. And the reason we went to China is that in our initial online research, we came to realize that some of the most beautiful parks were in China, and most of them are on a scale that we just don't know here. I mean, they devote many acres to parks there, and it's such an enormous country. I guess they can afford to do that. But I must say, we went twice to China. And traveled all over, up to the north. One of the most beautiful parks we saw was in the north, actually in the area that had been taken over by the Japanese in the 1930s. And actually, that city, Changchun, was figured in The Last Emperor. I don't know if you remember that movie that came out a few years ago about the last emperor of China. It was filmed in that park and in that city, and where they have an amazing park, very, very beautiful, large park there that actually was started by the Japanese in the 30s. But then of course, when they left China and this facility, which had been a water purification plant, was abandoned, the Chinese came in with designers and really cleaned it up and made it into a very, very beautiful park, which is unusual in the sense that they created elevated walkways through the canopies of the trees. And that is a really thrilling experience, to be going through a kind of forest, which instead of being on the ground, you're up in the tree canopies.
I'm glad you mentioned that one, because when I looked through the book and I saw that walkway going through the canopy of the trees, I was really excited by that. I thought, what a novel idea. We tend to build our pathways at ground level, so we're looking up at everything.
Yeah.
And the idea that you're actually up in there.
Yes.
I just was astounded by that wonderful idea. And it's like, how did we go so long and how did we miss that all this time? How do we not, the Chinese came up to say, let's just build it up here. Like, this is just a wonderful idea. I'm sure it's expense involved and stuff, but what a great idea to actually be there. The bird's eye view, I guess you could call it,
Right.
of being in a park.
Yeah.
Was just fascinating. And it is, and I was surprised, and I guess I don't know why I was surprised. I guess we all have our preconceived notions that the parks you pointed out in China are incredibly beautiful parks. Not that there aren't other incredibly beautiful ones, but I think we have this notion, and we don't think that China, being in certain places, is a very beautiful place.
Yes.
And as a photographer, I'm like, I need to try and figure out how to get out there, although I'm not sure that'll ever happen. But as somebody who's interested in taking pictures and landscapes and stuff, it just looked incredibly great. What other ideas do you think are coming out of this book that we haven't talked about yet?
I think one of the very interesting ideas is capping highways. More and more communities are objecting to these, super highways that bring noise and pollution and smell of exhaust and so forth. And so when we included a few of these in the book, one particularly interesting one in Holland, but we discovered afterwards, after we had chosen that one for the book, that there are at least half a dozen other major highways in different countries, notably Germany and other countries, where the same thing is happening. And it's really a nice idea that you can just cover over a park you can cover over a highway with a park. And one place where this idea may take place is in Los Angeles, where they're trying desperately to reclaim the Los Angeles River, which has been so problematic, which for one thing floods very dangerously, killing people and inundating places where people live and do business. And also parts of which have been, very, very seriously polluted. And one of the ideas that Frank Gehry, who's involved with trying to remediate this situation, is capping the river with very, very wide, you might call them bridges, but I mean, they're much wider than a normal bridge, and making a park on top of the bridge.
So it would follow like the length of the river kind of a thing, or maybe zigzag back and forth across it? Is that the idea?
Yes, well, it wouldn't be the whole river, of course. It would be periodically. There would be, this kind of spanning of the river that would introduce vegetation. I mean, the vegetation is very poor along the river. It's, since the government poured concrete all along that river to stabilize the bottom of the flow, that has wreaked havoc with the vegetation. So this would reintroduce vegetation.
And I guess we get people to appreciate the river without actually the hazard of going down to it. They would get to enjoy it from being above it. Again, the bird's eye view kind of thing.
Yes.
So, well, Victoria, this is a great book. I think it's the ideas presented in this are great. The inventiveness behind some of these ideas was just like we talked about the walkway through the treetops instead of below the trees. I think it was just outstanding. What's next? What other projects do you have coming up next?
Well, now I'm working on something back in my own discipline, which is architecture. And I'm putting together a collection of essays on affordable housing.
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah.
Which is a thing that's a big topic for discussion out here in the West. So I hope your research takes you out here to the West, because we can't build houses fast enough, and housing values are just going up outrageously fast, and the idea of affordable housing is becoming quite the issue out here in the Rocky Mountain West and the Desert West and stuff like that. It's becoming a big deal. The book is Parks of the 21st Century. Victoria Newhouse is the author, and she's been kind enough to spend some time with us here and tell us all about this book. Victoria, is there anything else you want to tell us about it that I may not have asked you about?
Well, I think you've done I think you've done your homework, Bob. I mean, you asked all the right questions, and I really enjoyed this talk.
Great. Well, I appreciate having you on here. Where can people find your book? If people want to take a look at this, where can they find the book?
Amazon. You can order it on Amazon.
Okay, great. And we will provide a link to it there for people to check out. And if you're interested in parks, or you're interested in how to make good use of space, this book is going to give you some great ideas. Victoria Newhouse, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. I'm honored to have been here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for listening to the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast.
Before you go, did you know you can rate and review our Studio 809 podcasts? That will help us, because our egos really need to have thousands and thousands of listeners. But that helps our wonderful sponsors reach more ears too. And we do love our sponsors. So just go to Studio 809 or any individual 809 podcast in your iTunes or podcast app and click on ratings and reviews. Thanks.